Welcome to episode 84 of Silver Lining for Learning. This is a very special day. It's just, the first episode we're running after Thanksgiving in 2021. And all of us have plans to say thank you. Thanks to our listeners. Thanks to our guests. Thanks to our host, everybody. We seem to have built enough episodes to be used in courses, to be used for probably study groups, to be used in many different ways. But these episodes are really a collection of innovations in education that's happening around the world. We're really highlighting a lot of those big issues in education. So today, we're going to reflect on what we've learned over the last 3 episodes, as well as over the last 83 episodes. But I want to ask every one of our guests, Chris Didi, Kurt Bunk, Punya Mishra, to start with a few minutes of monologue about your thoughts, because this Thanksgiving has helped me a lot. And for example, I finished The Irishman, the movie, 3.5 hours long, and I now know who killed Jimmy Hoffa and where he's buried. But now let's start with Chris Didi. You want to start with your 3 minutes of monologue?
Sure. I actually have a 2-part monologue because I'll do one part and then later I'll do the other part. So I'm sure that all of us and all of our viewers are horrified by yet another variant of the virus coming out that appears dangerous. And I think it's clear at this point that what we're in is the new normal. What we're in, or worse, is the new normal. Now, some of that is because of a very difficult virus. More of that is because of colossal human folly. And neither one of them seems to be going away anytime soon. So I would appreciate it if all the people who said we're so happy that the evil of online learning is over and we can return to the beauty and joy of face-to-face learning would back off and understand that we now live in a hybrid world, including the educational system living in a hybrid world. And unless you're going to send kids to school either unprotected or wearing suits like the scientists in the Andromeda strain, you're going to have to look at online learning. And if it's bad, it's your fault, because there's lots of good ways of doing online learning, but you refuse to accept them or to prepare for them or to acknowledge them. So it's time to step up and face the new normal and behave rationally about people's education. And we'll model that. We'll model that in this show, highlighting innovations from all across the world that are functioning in the new normal. So that's part 1. I'll hold part 2 for later, but that's part 1. It's a challenge to the critics.
Chris, I just want to have a little follow-up with your part 1, the case of China. Everyone knows China has this policy of really zero cases. So whenever they discover one case, they shut down cities, blocks, buildings. It's been trying that very hard, but it's never truly succeeded. So remote learning has become a new kind of de facto option. So whenever they shut down a block for 3 weeks, 2 weeks, they say, let's go remote learning. When they shut down schools, go remote learning, which is actually quite fascinating that we now have taken online learning as a de facto mechanical thing. But we don't really respect this online learning. But however, whenever the schools have to be shut down, let's go to remote learning. So I think that is something we need to study a lot more carefully, other than just, there is one option. But that option can be improved dramatically. That's something I think we need to think about. Kurt Bunk, what's your 3-minute monologue or 3 parts monologue?
No monologue prepared, but I will say I reviewed all 80 some shows, and I didn't physically watching each one of them for an hour, but I did watch some of them, and I'm come away with, what are the aspects, characteristics, features, or what I've been calling principles that underlie the change process within them. Are there some commonalities across them? And Chris brought up a really good point 2 weeks or 3 weeks ago with the show from China. He asked a question about scalability, and basically he answered his own question, not scalable. And I tended to agree with him right away, and I still do. But that leads me to wonder about what would make that particular program or initiative scalable, or what would make similar programs in Thailand or in Nepal or in Indonesia that want to do what they're doing and get volunteer teachers to educate and provide services and resources for those who are underprivileged, or haven't had access to the educational opportunities that others have had. And interviewing young children this morning from Nepal, bright and early, our team started at 6 a.m. I got there about 7. I let them do the first one. It's when I go to bed, basically. But I'm listening to these kids, and the access. I asked them a question. I said, "How has access been since you first started going online?" And the student had been learning online for 6 years, not just since the pandemic, but for 6 years, and that it's dramatically improved there. And not only that, many parents, when I've asked this question to other kids in Nepal, other kids have said their parents have gotten them the internet. Other kids have said that the parents have bought them a laptop or have provided a safe space to learn from at home because they're very impressed with what these children are doing. And I remember about 6 years ago when we had Afghan leadership training here at IU and educational training. And I asked the same question of those young adults in the program, and they said over the past 5-6 years in Afghanistan, because of the U.S. presence, internet access has improved. And so I'm seeing opportunities, and they're seeing opportunities that they hadn't seen before. And so, not just in Afghanistan, not just Nepal. I'm pretty sure it's happening in other places. So that begs the question, if other places want to create initiatives for students in the rural parts of their country, in the remote villages in their country, like the China program, what are the key aspects or the key principles that have to be put in place? And how do they create a community of leaders, of other teachers, of volunteer teachers? And how do they provide the training services to get them ramped up to teach online? Yes, I agree with Young. Yes, I agree with Chris. This is the new normal, but we still have to ramp up millions of teachers for this. So what are some viable models, contagious models, that will provide a different attitude among the politicians who are coming to us saying we go back to the old way. We go back, how do we change the persona about this, the energy towards this, the overall atmosphere or ethos about online learning? Part of it has to do with the training and development of teachers, but that can't be the only thing. We can't keep saying that. We say that year in and year out. What are other principles, other policies, other features? And Punya, I think, mentioned a few weeks ago, you talked about inquiry-based learning seems to underride many of these programs. And that's true, inquiry-based and problem-based learning underride. But it's not just that. What are the other things that cause these different initiatives to be successful or not successful? So maybe we need to map that out a little bit later on in the show. That's my 3-minute monologue.
So Kurt, since this is post-Thanksgiving, let me just place some challenges to the view about scale up. Perhaps we shouldn't looking for scale up. Perhaps nothing can be scaled up unless government mandate make it standardized. Perhaps what we need are students, self-determined, self-managing students instead of teachers, because I'm really worried. Every place you go, people always say we start with recruiting the best students from high school. We train them, we retain them. You know, we have a long-term plan for training millions of teachers, but that's never really happened. You will never get good enough teachers. So maybe we rethink the process. You know, I know Chris raised the issue about scale up. A lot of times we see models to say, I'm providing you knowledge, I'm providing you tutoring. But a lot of times that may actually be disabling factor. We may not be enabling our students to invent, to recreate the new possibilities. But I'm just trying to challenge it, and I don't know what I believe yet. Now let's get Punya to get your 3-minute monologue.
Before Punya jumps in here, I do agree with you, Young, that we have to think about self-determined learning or self-directed learners, not only about how to equip them with the skills to be self-directed, how to recognize them, how they can meta-reflect on them so they're empowered with them, but also what components can be put in place to foster a more self-directedness in their educational resources, in their programs, in their online courses. So I'm exploring what features can be placed in online courses which would help students be self-directed and recognize their self-directedness. Again, among the students we interviewed in Nepal, the definitions they're giving us for self-directed learning at age 14, 15, and 16 is what I would expect out of graduate students. They have been able to meta-reflect on their successes in such a sophisticated way, an unexpected way. You saw that during the program we had. But how can we replicate that, or how can we extend that? And so how could that be operationalized in under-resourced schools, underprivileged schools here in the USA or in other countries? So, I agree with you, and I think we can go one step further. Punya.
So I think it's kind of funny because, what the tension between like what Zhao is suggesting and Kurt, what you're saying, because at one level, the argument is that this is not scalable. At the other level is like, okay, how do we get systems at scale that students can be their own autonomous agents, right? I mean, I think there is a tension here which is yet to be resolved. Coming back to the broader thing of this being the Thanksgiving weekend, and I think I ended the last episode, I mean, with this point that I am always, it's literally every day in gratitude of all the opportunities and things that I've been given. And Thanksgiving, despite its history, is something that our family really values. Over the years, that's somehow become our festival in some way. I think partly because it's secular and, Indian kids growing up in the US. And so you find the one that resonates. And so my daughter always does this thing. She goes around like, what are you thankful for? And I was thinking about that. And for those of you who know or may not know, last year, December 30th, we got a puppy. And I had never, ever in my life had a pet before. So this was completely brand new. And I have to honestly say, I am a completely different person today than I was even 6 months ago. And the reason I bring it up, not because it's like a personal thing. I mean, personally, I've become vegetarian, blah, 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 because this sort of, it just brought, I mean, you can read these things intellectually, but having this animal who's completely sort of dependent on you, who has its own mind and its own feelings, and to acknowledge that it suffers. And the moment that acknowledgement sort of hits home, I was like, okay, I can't eat meat anymore. I just can't do it. Ethically, it just seems like the wrong thing to do. But there is this bigger thing, I think, which is this connection, which is what I'm bringing back to silver lining, however tenuous that might seem. But I think there's this bigger thing, which is this connection that all of us have to life on this planet. I'm looking at some of the statistics coming out of CDC. Forget the impact of COVID and online learning and so on. 1 in 4 Black students has somebody, a caregiver who they have lost to this pandemic. The number for Hispanic and Latinx is 1 in 3. I mean, the trauma that this thing will have for years to come is something that we haven't even begun to scratch the surface. And however much I might believe, and the funny thing is, like, I agree with the point that this thing of scalability is a challenge, that when we want to truly acknowledge the richness and complexities of individual impulses, individual agency, I look at some of the challenges that we are facing, and I think that as a field, as education, we have our heads in the sand. I mean, global climate change, migration, all of these things, wars over water or whatever, or resources, limited resources, we are facing or coming up to some really significant challenges. And this pandemic, I think, is just the tipping point of that. And I think that the kinds of ethical and moral decision-making, Chris, I think you mentioned that, I don't know whether it was before the program or right at the beginning, where you said that I think I'm going to paraphrase you here because I don't remember the exact words, but this pandemic has shown us that, that this pandemic is here to stay in some ways. And the other thing that's here to stay is human stupidity, our inability to come together. This is, so many science fiction stories like Independence Day and movies have been made about that once the human race faces a global challenge, we will come together. And I think that this pandemic has shown us that that is not necessarily true. We have the resources, the wherewithal, the intellectual capital, these supply chain systems to vaccinate everybody in the world, to be able to test at a much better level, to be able to identify these things coming, these new variants coming out. We have the ability to do all of that. And we have shown none of that ability in any systematic shape or form. And I think that, to me, despite all the things that I am grateful for, that this connection that I more strongly feel with every living thing on this planet, I just feel very despondent about some of these things. And I'll make one final point, which is the episode that we had around Meta. And one of the concerns I have is that we have organizations like this, which are bigger than nations today. They're bigger than most nations, the amount of power that they have, but the absolute lack of accountability. Facebook or Meta, whatever the company is, spends 85% of its fight against misinformation budget in the United States, because that's where the media markets are. It does not care for the Rohingya in Myanmar. It does not care for the Muslims in India. And I think that that's another big challenge we face. And whether we like it or not, however much as educators we might want to love these smaller initiatives which show great power and so on for individual children, I think they are also living in an ecosystem which is run by these large corporations which have zero accountability. So I'm sorry to sound despondent, but I think that these are significant challenges that we as a field have really not gotten deeply into.
Let me jump in here, Punya. You'll notice you can hear me this week. I am not wearing earbuds. That was the problem. So those earbuds were a problem. And I assume you can hear me clearly now.
What are you saying,
Kurt?
I can hear. I can see clearly now. So I want to mention that anyone interested in what Punya just said, all of our listeners who's interested in what Punya just said, come next week, because Mahabali is an expert resource related to emotional adjustments, emotionally sensitive online learning. So she's created two organizations, virtuallyconnecting.org, a grassroots movement that challenges academic gatekeeping at conferences, and Equity Unbound, an equity-focused, open, connected, intercultural learning curriculum. And she's very much a voice in the area of social justice, critical pedagogy, and open and online learning. The title focuses on open and online learning, but we're going to very much get into emotional adaptations, emotional the side of considering one's emotions, what one has to struggle with day in and day out before you create and when you deliver your online learning. So I think it'll be an important session next week. So I just want to mention that, Punya, that not only that, Punya, please come with questions for next week, because your questions will springboard a whole set of issues and themes for maybe even the coming weeks after next week. So next week will be just the start, I think.
I just want to go back to what Punya was saying about Meta and Google and Facebook. I mean, not Facebook, Twitter, all of these tools. You know, technically, Punya, there's several issues there. I've been thinking a lot about this. One, technically, these systems enable individuals who are willing to speak to have a voice. You know, dictators who used to have armies and just to ban them with their own propaganda departments. So technically, anyone could jump on Meta, jump on any of the system to own their own channel. So why aren't students, why aren't reasonable people jumping on to make the same argument? And of course, you can say some of the companies manipulate their algorithm, they can try all of those things. But at the same time, there are ways to fight back. I'm not saying there are no problems. I'm not defending any of this. I'm just saying there are people who could go back because the misinformation is not necessarily manufactured by these companies, but however, those companies could favor them and go against others. Another issue I think, Kurt, is I was more worried about the cultural definition of emotions, the cultural shaping of emotions. I had this Thanksgiving, I had a conversation with my children. Punya, you might say the same. You know, they went to school in Michigan. And they were, I mean, now they're in their 20s, 30s, they're really telling me how emotionally disturbed they are by the norms created in schools. You know, they are always been made to be the non-white, and they're always judging that, oh, you're supposed to be number one in math. You're supposed to do that. There's all this kind of interesting expectations, which, you know, a white teacher dominates the classroom, and none of those were explicit. You know, the social rules made in schools are not explicit, but yet they make you feel you're not part of this. You know, that is, so when you're talking about emotional access, you know, like in Meta, whatever you create, how does that connect with other people? I'm not saying all cultural things can be defended necessarily, but I'm just saying there are differences, different possibilities. I think, you know, another point I just wants to make, since you guys give me the opportunity to say this, is that when we do online learning, when we're trying to reach a global audience, how are we connecting globally? I just wrote a chapter with Jim Waterston Arena about the idea about distributed student populations. Just imagine, you know, Harvard, Chris, you guys have students, they're simply distributed, they're not here, but they're distributed across. How do you connect with them? Are we going to have a westernized, homogenized definition of social emotional well-being and the cultures? And how do we deal with that? So that's, I think, the issues we talked about, you know, over the last several weeks, you know, from China, you know, you have students in the US tutoring Chinese students in rural areas. How does culture connect? You have the UNESCO report about future of learning. How do you really respect? We raised that issue before. And how does Meta, who is going to have this, I don't know, uncountable amount of data, I mean, content to reach so many people, how do we deal with that? And that goes back to individuals, and how do we prepare individuals to think through that? Anyway, Chris, are you ready for your part two?
I am, and I think it builds on what we've been talking about. So the week before Thanksgiving, I went to an invited panel that I spoke at Harvard's Innovation Lab, the iLab. And this was a student-run, bottom-up chance for people from all across the schools at Harvard to come who were entrepreneurial, who saw ed tech as an opportunity to be entrepreneurial and improve education. There were a couple hundred people there. There was a lot of energy. There were a lot of great ideas, a lot of really smart people. I was happy to have the chance to speak to them. And I began by saying, I'm excited about what you're doing, and what you're doing is similar to what I've done for most of my career, which is to have some ideas do design, do research, try to build something that's useful, try to find a way to scale it up, try to find a way to make it sustainable. But I said, but that's not what I'm going to talk about tonight. And what I talked about is the work of Judith Okonkwo, bringing VR to Africa. She was part of episode 19, and then more recently I interviewed her for one of our programs at the Harvard Ed School. And it's available online for anybody who's interested in the interview. But her work is bottom up. And I said to the students, we need balance. We need people like us designing top-down things and making them work. But we also need to take people who deeply understand their culture, who deeply understand their context, who have an innovation going that looks really good, right? Silver lining for learning, and give them not resources, because we don't have resources. We're kind of bottom up ourselves as entrepreneurs and professors, but expertise. Because typically what these initiatives are lacking, one thing they're lacking is research and evaluation to document their effectiveness, and expert advice on how to improve their scale without undercutting their quality and practicality. And so I said, you should consider, instead of starting something new, helping something that's already going, or at least doing both, because those innovations probably have a better chance of succeeding if we give them some help. And they have 100% better chance of helping the people that we would like to help, because they're done by people who are local, who understand the culture and the context. Now, this relates to our recent shows on Silver Lining for Learning. We had two shows, one about UNESCO and one about Meta, that are really about top-down change. And the discussion in the UNESCO show in particular was interesting, because some of us said, well, yes, that's useful, but there's a lot that's lost in not also in those records advocating for and providing resources for bottom-up change. And we had episode 79, which was about new models of philanthropy. And the Wend Collective and our guest from Grantmakers for Education talked about philanthropy that doesn't start by saying, we've got the money and we know how to fix you, so why don't you apply to come get some? Philanthropy that starts by going to the people who need help and saying, you're the experts on what you need and how you need it. Let us listen to you and work with you and help empower you to do what needs to be done. So I think that this sort of tension between top-down and bottom-up pervades universities, it pervades venture capital, it pervades large nonprofits that are attempting to improve things worldwide. It pervades a lot of things, and we've got to find a way to get to a better balance with helping the people that we're celebrating in Silver Lining for Learning, that are doing things richly embedded in culture and context. And what they need is not paternalism. What they need is people who listen and who then supply the expertise to do what they want to do.
So Chris, in many ways, we're a show that has certain bias. In many ways, we're talking about the people you want to serve. So, you're talking about, the philanthropy to the people you want to give money to who actually can act on that. I remember many years ago in the UK, they were trying that model. Instead of giving you money, they work with you through a process. It's about really control CO2 emissions. So that in the communities that anyone, not just the environmental protection organizations, can submit proposals. anyone could propose by this time, we would reduce the emission by this much. And then the first round, they would work with you to send experts review. So by the time they reach that certain level, most of them already solve the problem. So they use the actually grant money to do something else. But I was thinking about the other bias, which I have a lot, is students. Schools and education technically works to serve students. But after talking to so many students, looking at so many schools, how I feel education or people always have a very strong opinion of their own definition. What makes good education? Again, my children talk about school norms. School norm, who makes a school norm? What makes you a troublemaker? They actually try to define those things. And then how well we want to defend our curriculum and our testing. Unless all of those things are more or less shaken, it's very hard to return to the opportunity to be working with our students. So I'm hoping through our show, through other ways, we can work with teachers, with schools to really drive a lot more. I don't mean, just, students, you follow our curriculum, you're a good student. But what about something else? We're in a different time. So here I want to really just bring back Kurt and Punya. You guys, what are your thoughts over this many episodes beyond Punya, how the dog has changed? I have a cat who has come to change me. I'm not changed yet, but I think that's going to happen.
I'll let you go first. Go
Okay.
ahead.
Yeah, and so I want to come back to that tension that I'd mentioned before, because I think that, and when I'm thinking about looking across the episodes, the ones that really stand out to me are the ones which are trying to make some kind of systemic change, which has the learner at the center. So Zhao, remind me of this. I always mess up the name. This is the consortium of schools, the global, what are they called?
Global Online Academy.
Global Online Academy. For me, that is like a really powerful example, because it is saying that not every school can provide everything to every student, that there can be different ways, different pathways that we can develop, that students can be part of this global world. To me, that's offering sort of a systemic response, which still keeps the individual learner interests, the localization, the power of that still at the center. So I think it's things that way, which again, Chris, totally sort of agreeing with your point, the example that you gave, which is, I see a lot of these as well, right? You see these companies, we can fix education if I have the magic bullet, right? And it's like, you just don't know education. It's different in different parts of this city that I'm living in right now. Forget across the globe, right? And so I think that balance between sort of local and global, thinking of systems that do keep the learners at the center, but do approach it in a systemic way, because otherwise, I think the scale of the challenges that we face are just staggering. Kurt?
So, I'm thinking about as I look through the list of 80-some shows, some of them are top-down, some are bottom-up. But another way to look at it is some are community-based and many individuals in the community making it happen, and others are an individual creating a community, crafting one, designing one, or advocating for one from their many efforts. Paul Kim is a case in point, where that's one individual who's been able to extensively substantially impact education from his mobile learning project and adding enhancements to it using AI, who could use the funding resources that Chris just talked about if they saw what he's been able to do. He has other funds, of course, with Stanford Smile Project. But some of the people have done Paul Kim-like efforts, and I think this show, each of our shows, has different aspects or different lenses on what hope means in education. And in some cases, the hope is provided from the inspirational passions of a person who's able to, and like Bahman, his name is Bahman in Nepal, that one teacher got dozens of schools in Nepal to adopt MOOCs during the pandemic. One person can set the wheels in motion with the right inspirational juices, the leadership and the community and the celebrations. There's certain things that he's doing there. And there's certain things that Paul Kim is doing to create, to enhance literacy skills of blind children in India and in the Dominican Republic, or underprivileged youth in Rwanda or in Indonesia. That's, to me, those types of shows are extremely inspirational, because it means that anybody who enters our field, or some aspect of our field, or tangential related to our field, has a chance to make a huge impact on their own, with a little bit of some support of others around them. But individuals matter, I guess, is what I'm saying. And the show of the woman who had NSF grant money, Jenny Pennycook, down in Antarctica, studying the Adelie penguin and sending it out to 300 schools around the country, and sending her researches out and having problems that students are solving and getting energized. It's similar to a global academy, Young. She's created a global network of schools following her scientific research. And Cassandra Brooks had done the same thing before her, looking at the Antarctic toothfish in her weekly blog postings of her studies during her master's thesis and beyond. So there's certain individuals that pop out when I review the 80 odd shows that make me smile, in effect. And, you know, in the back of my mind, I almost want to tap into each one of them and have them write their, we could have a short book about these different inspirational settings and people, a compendium of, we could compile that. But anyways, that's what, to me, that's what caught my attention looking this week.
So,
Kurt, I'm
no,
sorry,
Zal,
Punya,
can I just add one
go ahead.
comment to that? I think the thing that stands out, these stories are inspirational for sure. I don't disagree with that. But the creativity that most of the people that we have talked to, that they brought to this, where they saw the situation they were in and found opportunities within that, has actually been something that has really stood out for me as well. So it's inspirational, but it's also very creative.
So I want to really bring out another issue. I just want to ask you, because we've been talking a lot about how, you know, how do you teach, how do you learn, how do you create systems, how do you do this? And I'm reminded of Punya, the two friends you had from India. Most reminded of show of Tony Wagner and Ted Dintersmith. And so I really, even like Chris, so when we think about this, the what of learning, because I'm quite aware of what's happening in different education systems are different. You know, some people would suggest that any education can liberate people. Is that true? Or do we have to question what we want our children to learn? And when we talk about learning, are we really talking about learning of the same things? And or do we want to say, do we have a view of an enlightened and educated person as a homogeneous view for everybody to go? You know, I think that that's a lot of times we question those things. Or, you know, like OECD does, you know, I kept, you know, I criticize the PISA a lot. The PISA has basically, you know, reading, math, and science. Is that the core subject? Should we do, or should we have something else? I just want you guys to throw ideas there. The idea here, I know, Punya, you would like to have some philosophers to come in to debate about this. You know, what kind of societies should human beings create? Or should there be one society, one type of citizens? I think education may have come to a time that goes beyond the simply how, but really the what kind of people are we interested in creating? I was just wondering, Chris, Kurt, and Punya, anyone wants to respond?
I think that's a question of the hour in some ways. I really think that the challenges that we face today, and particularly Zhao, the way you have talked about this sort of global learner and so on. I think that is the challenge of our time. I think that unless and until we define where we want to go, we are doing the best with a certain set of goals that were determined a long back. And so I would love to get some people who are both historians and philosophers of education to engage in this conversation with us. I think there's a lot that we have to learn from them.
As someone who's reading Walter Isaacson's book on Jennifer Doudna and the CRISPR-Cas9 system, I'm a little hesitant about creating people, because that's the point where they're at in the book, where I'm at in the book right now, trying to genetically modify human beings. And I don't know if educators are going to get into that game anyways, but we can influence the skills, and definitely we're going to have something to say about the skills and abilities one has within a very biologically intensive world that we're entering in, or with the CRISPR system. So yeah.
But Kurt, we're already doing that. You know how many pills are fed into children? You know how many special education interventions we have implemented? You know how many kids get sent home and disciplined? We're in essence already creating. I was actually I did not finish the movie. It's not a good movie. It's called Last Few Days of American Crime. Something said the government has invented a technology which can turn out your any criminal intentions. So if that's possible, would parents want to buy that? So I was just really curious to say what kind of possibilities exist. But we do need to ask the question though, because we have this outcome based, right? So education is outcome. In essence, we decide to equip you with something, not to equip you with something else, right? And so we discipline somebody. How many classroom management discipline books there are? We must identify something to be disciplined. The socially, emotionally healthy people are endorsed, and those were not. But how do we define that, right? Again, how many pills we fit kids to say, oh, you have anxiety. We want to cut that down. You shouldn't be so anxious, so you can be healthier. So how do we think about that? It's not brain research, brain surgeon yet, but those medicines do control your neural activities.
So Watson's alive and well.
Oh no, but I'm just curious to say I don't know how to think. I'm just look at all this data, this interesting things. I was just wondering, Chris, do you want to jump in to give any of your wise thoughts?
Well, I like the metaphor of ecosystems, and we know that natural ecosystems are stronger the more diverse they are, diverse in their ecological niches, diverse in the species that inhabit those, diverse in the interconnections among all of the species. And we also have a human ecosystem now, a global human ecosystem that has niches, that has loosely defined species in the sense of cultures, that has much more tenuous connections between them, and that is gravely endangered, I think, by the species sort of warring with one another rather than recognizing not only mutual dependence, but also the benefits of multi-perspectival views of phenomena and challenges. And one of the things that I always say in my classes is that this is a class about helping you understand how to use educational technology to make really powerful systems for learning. But recognize that those can also be really powerful systems for propaganda, that they can also be really powerful systems for enfranchising the privileged even further and pushing the marginalized down even further, that ed tech is a double-edged sword, and actually most of the time it's used in the wrong edge is being used in terms of making a positive difference in the world. And so I think one of the things that we're doing in in this is identifying parts of the human ecosystem that are wonderful in terms of what's happening there, but also very much at risk because they're on the edge of viability and sustainability. And we're hoping that by lifting them up and celebrating them and giving them at least some advice about scale and sustainability, that we're helping them. But I wish that there were as many people concerned about the human ecosystem as there are about the natural ecosystem. That's not criticizing anybody that's concerned about the natural ecosystem. If we don't take care of that, there won't be a human ecosystem. But I wish that we had the same kind of care about that, and the same recognition that education is a double-edged sword, depending on how it's done.
You know that about the human ecosystem, because you look at human society today, you got so many different versions of it. Apparently, there is a celebration of moving towards more human individual liberty, individual freedom, more egalitarian societies. You look through this whole process. Generally we celebrate democracy, all those kind of things. So I was just wondering, again, Chris, Kurt, and Punia, if we're not philosophers, but if we were going to try to create, is there an ideal man, like Plato would say, or John Dewey would say, is there an ideal man that we want to cultivate? If so, what technology, what environments, what experiences, we want to go? Definitely want to have a, egalitarian society, but more diversity, sustainability, and respect of individual freedom. So all of those things matter. So, but how schools as one institution, schools, as built institution, always favors one type of people, the system designates it to do. So how do we elevate that? How do we change that? I think in our future episodes, we should get more people come to make those arguments. Like you were saying, just understanding it can do good, it can do bad. Another thing we were talking about is artificial intelligence coming up. How do we live with AI? How do we live with it? Another thing is that, I think one thing we don't talk a lot about anymore. Remember, Punia, we used to talk about digital competency. How do you live with these digital devices? How do you live in the digital world? Those things I think are really part of humanity, and that is we live in a different world with different capacities. And how do we work with that? Kurt, Punia, or Chris?
I think throughout this show, you've been talking about what we should be doing in the future shows to some degree. And part of it is social emotional aspects of learning has to be more front and center within maybe a series of our shows. Maybe I've been thinking about for the past couple of days, do we need to have shows on AI and robotics? Maybe having a series of 2, 3, 4 shows on that as well. And so I'm wondering if, and maybe a show just about a couple of shows about what is scalability in today's age? What does that mean? What does it look like? Has anyone been thinking about, or does anyone know any experts in the areas of AI or robotics that we could have a series of shows on that?
So I'm sort of wary about getting people who are in the nitty-gritty of creating AI systems. Again, not saying that we shouldn't get them as guests, but I think that we should also complement them with people who are, the McLuhan-esque thinkers, right? Who are thinking deeper about the ways in which technologies transform and change who we are and what we do, right? I'm thinking of Walter Ong. I'm thinking, it's people of that ilk that I think would be very interesting, because they look beyond sort of the surface thing of the technology to look at sort of what are the inherent values and things that are being enhanced and what is being made easy, what is being made difficult because of these tools, right? And how do those then transform the nature of social interaction, the nature of meaning making, the nature of relationships that we have.
Well, I
would
think
love to
Chris
get some
knows a
people
lot
there.
of those. Chris been participating in those things. Chris. So we'll bring you back, Chris, in a little bit, because another point I want to make is about ethics. Which Chris mentioned about the ethics of online, of technology, but also, there's something called green invention. I've been on the advisory board for the Lemosin Foundation, Portland, Oregon. They support invention education. And they're supporting India, they're supporting Africa, they're supporting the US, they work with, the Smithsonian, all those things. But one of the things they've been focusing is green and ethical invention. You can't just teach kids to invent something that actually can do damage, but you want to invent something that's valuable. I could invite some guests from that foundation to really talk about how do you support a new ecosystem of inventors. They're talking about invent to become better. Invention is invention to become more prosperous, but also how do you invent the right way, the right things?
Sure. No, I think that would be great.
Yeah.
Oh,
So, but Chris, I was wondering, because you introduced me to that website, Circus of Digital Promise. I think Pune was describing of people, maybe most likely like Jeremy Rochelle from that organization might be able to provide what we're looking for.
I think it would be very interesting to have Jeremy Rochelle and Barbara Means as guests.
Yeah.
Because Barbara is certainly one of the people who's very much influenced the field, and she and Jeremy working together have really accomplished a lot, first at SRI and now at Digital Promise. And both of them are strategic thinkers. So I think it would be great to do an episode like that.
You want to invite them, Chris?
Yeah, I'll write a note to myself to invite Jeremy and Barbara. And
we have a couple of questions/comments which has just dropped in the chat from Mei on the YouTube channel. I don't know if anybody wants to. Zhao, you might be the person to.
Well, let me say this. First of all, you guys know there was a guy from Google that got out. They were building micro schools in San Francisco. I think they built one in New York, and they had to shut down because they were designing a system using technology to capture that. I visited some of the schools, very small, tiny school, very promising, the micro schools, but it was not really spreading across globally. So I like very like neighborhood school, learning centers. I also like a combination of tiny schools with online combinations, like Pune was saying, global online learning. If I had a group of 20 kids, but they will also do online with the kids in other countries, that would be really beautiful. A nice combo of small, tiny micro schools. But if you need to access labs or facilities, you go to rent, in different places. That would be a beautiful element of future. I wouldn't necessarily call them schools. I call them learning networks or learning communities.
Thank you.
Now you're
being the audience for the question. Please, John, you're in the audience. Throw us a question from Ireland. See, you're in there. We're happy to answer. We got 5 minutes left in this show. So who else wants to jump in here?
Kurt, you sound like we have nothing else to say. Go say something, You sound like you're begging someone to say, ask us something.
I agree with Chris that Barbara and Jeremy would be great guests. And that's exactly the type of people we need to start thinking about. We've got a number of shows open in January, February, March, and we should start filling those in. And I think that would be one of the top shows that,
We shouldn't forget that Posse Salberg had agreed to sing on our 100th episode.
Yeah, we should definitely get him back.
If nothing else, we have to get him to record a song and we'll play the dang recording, but he promised, so we got to hold him to that.
Oh, okay. Yeah, we'll do that. we have got to, Punya, as per your, really, I think, strong advocate, we got to get some big people talking about philosophy. I really think.
So I have some names in mind. Let me just dig through. I was going through listening to some podcasts in the recent past. It might be interesting to see who in the speculative fiction landscape is thinking about education or learning. I know who's the guy who wrote Snow Crash?
Neil
Excuse me?
Neil Stephenson.
Neil Stephenson, thank you. He has this whole vision of this education pod or whatever he calls. So, it might be interesting to get some people like that. Part of it is, I think this show can also, has been recognizing human ingenuity and creativity in the education space. There is no reason why we cannot go a little deeper or further to have some of these conversations.
Beyond the thinkers, we need to also get some university presidents to come to think about where they think higher ed is going, because that's still an institution that's not collapsed yet. That's still shaping where kids will go, right? For a while.
See, I agree with you all, but I still think our 100th show, we should think about bringing each of our kids to the show and having them tell us what learning and education is all about as younger people in the real world. We want to talk about it. So, I'd be happy to have my son or daughter come in and if they want to. That'd be, I think, a good way to celebrate show 100, or some other way. Maybe university presidents would be a good way too.
No, I don't mean the 100th show. I just meant we want to explore the issue of the future. We could bring some very humanitarian thinkers to the very economy-driven educators. Like Chris, for example, probably you could get to we could get to the pizza guy, Andrea Schlecker, and he could come and we could have a debate with him. But don't let him know we're debating. But that's the idea, to have someone who is opposed to that view. Like maybe Pune, we get Dave Berliner from your shop. Really, they would have an interesting argument about this issue to say, why do you do this and why don't you do this? Those kind of things. I think we can explore some bigger possibilities.
Right.
I agree.
We're at the end of time here, guys. Punya, final comment before I introduce the next show?
No, as always, thank you, and hope everybody's doing well, and on to the next one.
So next week at 11:30 a.m. Eastern time, 8:30 in the morning in Oregon, 9:30 in the morning in Arizona, we're going to talk to people in Egypt about the many faces of openness, meet the many faces of online learning in Egypt. We're going to have Maha Bali, who's often a blog poster in the Chronicle of Higher Education. She's been a frequent keynote speaker around the world during the pandemic, talking about social and emotional adjustments in online learning, diversity, equity, and inclusion, social justice, critical pedagogy are among the topics that she will be talking about. And her and Nadine, and I can't pronounce Nadine's last name, have a chapter in a recent book of mine on MOOCs and open education. And Nadine will come in as well. She's a senior instructional designer at the Center for Teaching and Learning in American University of Cairo. They're both from the American University of Cairo. It'll be interesting to talk to them next week about what they've been up to during the pandemic and hopefully beyond. So please come next week, everyone.